everyone, and welcome. I'm so super excited and grateful to be here today, joined by someone that I really admire and I have become very close with. Hi, Reed. How are you doing today?
I'm great. How you doing, Maritza?
I'm doing awesome. And so everyone joining us, whether you are going to join us live or if you're going to watch this recording, this is going to be a very important topic that we're going to be covering today. Today's topic is unlocking success, expert tips on selecting the perfect location for your first practice. If you are a startup dentist, if you are an associate doctor, and you have this ownership bug that you want to consider practice ownership and you don't know how to get started, what to do, or who to reach out to, this is going to be a conversation that you're going to want to benefit, that you're going to definitely benefit from. So, um, before I jump in and I start asking the questions, because what I've done is put together a list of frequently asked questions from doctors that reach out to me all the time. I want to make a proper introduction to Reed and allow him to tell us a little bit more about himself. So, about Reed Wrisley, you grew up in Connecticut and graduated from West Virginia University with a BA in international business and a minor in Spanish. In another episode, he promised to do a Spanish version, and I am going to put him to the test. So we'll watch and see. Um, but
I'm
prior
ready.
to getting involved in the dental industry and real estate, he was a real estate broker for residential, real estate. And so, since he started working on the dental industry, his company with Practice Real Estate Group has opened over 2,000 locations, and he's been very hands-on and experiencing everything that it takes for a dentist to be successful. And so, Reed, start by telling us a little bit more about yourself. Did I get everything right? And tell us a little bit about yourself and your family. That's also something that everyone wants to get to know you and learn from you about.
Sure. No, that's spot on. Grew up in northern Connecticut in the Hartford area. Went to school in West Virginia, as you mentioned. And after school, I moved to Boston. Started really my professional career in residential mortgages. And I relocated to New York in 2007, continued doing that. So I've seen a few different markets, good and bad, with residential and commercial and everything in between. And in 2009, I started my career in residential real estate. And for the past 5 years, I've been working with doctors on the healthcare side.
Awesome. So tell us about your family. What does Reed look like on the regular, day to day with his family? What do you like to do for fun? Tell us a little bit more about you as an individual.
Sure. Well, I have a 2 and 6 year old, so they definitely take up a lot of my time, but, they're the best things possible, of course. I love to play golf, hang out with the family, try to play in some pickup soccer games, but ever since I moved out of Manhattan, it's just been kind of difficult in the suburbs. But that's sort of
You
me in a
think so?
nutshell.
To play soccer, it's becoming more challenging in the suburbs? How so?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like New York, there's just obviously so many more people. And,
Oh, I see.
I played on a team where I think we were playing 4 times a week. Like it was somewhat intense, but in a good way, just trying to keep in some sort of semblance of a shape. But so, yeah, it's definitely become a little bit more difficult. But I would say most of the time I'm just hanging out with the fam and, playing a little golf.
Well, I know that your time is very, valuable. So, on behalf of myself and everyone that will be benefiting from this conversation with you, thank you so much.
Thank you
We're
for having
really
me.
honored to have you, and thank you for making yourself available to answer these questions. So,
Cool.
the reason why I said let me reach out to someone is because often a good percentage of dentists who are associates are always curious about what would it look like for me to own a practice, and they work for a group or they work for an individual and they feel stuck. They feel that maybe this is not the right fit for them. They feel that they
Mhm.
could potentially do a better job if they begin to explore that possibility. And so they begin to take the leap of faith and
Sure.
decide, hey, this is the right time, or maybe not. They're concerned about when is the right time to start practice ownership. So the very first question, and you can by all means tell me some of the questions that are brought to your attention, and some of the concerns that you deal with on the day-to-day basis. But one of the biggest questions that I get all the time is, should I do a startup or should I do an acquisition? What is your take on that? And what do you see and what do you recommend?
Sure. No, absolutely. I mean, there's never really a right or wrong solution. I guess it's just in the timing of finding the proper situation for what you're looking for. Most of the startup doctors that I work with, I feel like they've tried to do the acquisition or purchase practice, and sometimes it's just not out there. Sometimes it is the perfect situation and it works out in the end. But, I feel like there's definitely a good number of doctors that think that would be the best way to go. And it's not always, just because really the two biggest differences between a startup and an acquisition, you're going to be making money pretty much right away when you purchase a practice. And obviously that's a huge thing. But in the startup realm, it does take a little longer to really ramp up business. But I think when you work with professionals like you and I, and you work with the right teams that we already have in place that we do on a daily basis, we can make that happen for you faster. I think really the two biggest things will be the amount of time of what you're going to make, when you're going to start making money. I feel like that's really the biggest thing. But startup is great, and so is an acquisition. It really just depends on the exact situation for each doctor.
That is a very honest and transparent answer, because as a real estate broker wanting or focusing mostly on finding commercial space for startup practices, it is very transparent of you to say, hey, it depends on your ability to plan accordingly and have a game plan. So, but the reality is, and we have had clients in common, that they come to me and they have P&Ls and they have a practice that they want to, because they feel, and it is to your point, yes, there is immediate cash flow when you are able to take a book of business from an existing practice. You already have a team in place, which is something that helps you with not having to hire and start, and you feel like you have the inexperience to do this, and the time and
Sure.
the effort and the energy and the money. But at the same time, what we have experienced with some of these acquisitions currently and in the past is that it's not necessarily the best deal. And then you
Mhm.
run the risk of, yes, you're going to have immediate cash flow. Yes, you're going to have a team in place. And yes, you're going to have a book of business. But what I've experienced, and you tell me if this is right or wrong in your experience as well, is that sometimes the office is not as profitable as the numbers typically say.
Mhm.
The team and the culture is not going to be necessarily something that you are going to be ideally in alignment to with
Mhm.
once you get there, and that may create some stress. I have had dentists that acquire practices, and we have meetings, and they're like really stressed out
Oh,
over the whole
sure.
process of dealing with the already an established seasoned team. It could go both ways. And then lastly, there is no guarantee that the patients, if there's not a good transition between the model of the seller and your vision, that the patients are guaranteed to stay with you. So it
Oh,
requires a lot more of your work and grinding, if you will, to make an acquisition work. And to your point, I've seen it work very well for certain doctors and go horribly wrong with
mhm.
others.
Sure.
But like, I want to say that more than 50% of doctors, that are a higher percentage of dentists that decide that they want to consider first the acquisition, end up eventually having to consider the startup. And so that leads me to the next question that I have for you,
Sure.
which is, what should the next step be for a dentist who is looking, an associate dentist that wants to consider practice ownership. So we recommend that they explore potentially both options, knowing the pros and cons of doing a startup or doing an acquisition. But what would be the next most important step that a associate dentist looking to get into the practice ownership route should consider?
Sure. Well, I would say financing is definitely the most important part. And then real estate is usually second, in my opinion, not just because I'm a real estate broker, but you can't put equipment in there. You can't build out a space or do anything of the like without a space. So I think that's obviously just as important, or just behind financing, I should say. But I think it's good to understand the basic costs of doing both an acquisition or a startup, just to kind of feel out the numbers, because you got to start somewhere. And I think it's good to be open-minded for everything, where I've worked with doctors that look to purchase a practice for 2 to 4 years. And, if they had worked with me the first time we connected, they could have already been 2 to 3 years into their practice and built exactly from the ground up of how they wanted it to work out. So I think really financing and just kind of understanding the process as a whole. And, as I always harp on,
when it comes to financing, a lot of the things that come to it, that go hand in hand with financing, do you think that it should be also how much practice can you afford in terms of does that then come to my following question was, do I lease or do I purchase the real estate? I think that that's also one of the questions that come to mind. And so walk us through the phases, if you will, and how one is connected to the other to give them a better understanding of selecting the best potential practice.
Sure. Well, to purchase the real estate, it's going to depend on where you're located. Where we are in the New York area, obviously everything is definitely on the higher end in terms of how much everything costs, plus building out of space. So that's going to change everything. But, really, again, I think it's great to be open-minded in trying to potentially lease or to find something to purchase, because both can work very well, but there's always going to be some sort of a limitation with your finances and through the bank's loan approval. So I think it's good to kind of see both aspects. Okay. One example I love to use is when you're buying a car. If you're pre-qualified for $50,000, you're not looking for a $300,000 car. And it's kind of,
one would hope, right?
Yeah, you never know. So, the same thing sort of when it comes to buying commercial real estate is you want to know what you can afford and what you'd qualify for, just because you want to spend your time efficiently in trying to find the right opportunity in the right space. So I think it's good to know what can work best for you in your situation at that time.
So it's important to understand how much practice you can afford.
Yeah,
before
absolutely.
You go out there and you start window shopping a $300,000 car on a $50,000 budget.
Exactly. Yes. No.
Okay.
Exactly.
Perfect. Awesome. So that leads me to so that shows the importance of the financing. And what are some of in your experience, because I want to touch on leasing and how to properly negotiate a lease, but I think that I want to touch a little bit on the pros and cons of doing a lease versus the option of owning. What are some of the benefits to doing either one of those two options?
Sure. So a lease you can eventually get out of, whether the time runs out or you're going to have some sort of an out at one point. And obviously we'll try to negotiate that for you. We're trying to put you in the best situation possible, even for the unknown that might come down the line. But, I would say owning the real estate is just going to be more expensive, but you get the tax write-off. You do have some benefits. You're going to grow equity in the practice and the building that you purchase. So that's really the biggest difference. And I think a lot of startup doctors want to do both, but just don't realize that you could be $2 to $4 million in the hole, so to speak, from day one, just for doing that, where that just might not be in the cards.
I get it. So in other words, what you're saying is that the lease gives you more flexibility in terms of being able to get in and out.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of doctors struggle with the idea, if I already established my practice and my brand at this location and something happens, with the lease. And again, that's going to be my follow-up question. But what you're saying is, if I'm understanding correctly, is that ownership would be the ideal scenario in terms of the tax benefits and that comes with owning the real estate. But the disadvantage to that option would then be that they're going to be at a higher, debt or financial hole starting off to be able to make it work. So they have to work harder. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, again, there's always some sort of limitations.
We have one Facebook user that says patients definitely follow the doctor. So thank you for sharing that with us. Yeah. So you were saying.
Sure. No. There's always some sort of limitation. Even when I work with doctors who have 5 locations and want to open their 6th practice, there's always a way to make something work. And we'll be able to figure it out through our teams and through our process. It's a tried and true practice to make it work for you. But, again, there's just some sort of limitations. And it's great that some doctors want to think big and want to have that extra space, but it's not always in the budget of the card. So I think that's why it is important just to kind of get a whole snapshot. One of the things that I love telling my doctors is that I've racked my brain trying to figure this out. I don't think there's any other business that you could start in this country, maybe in the world, where you get almost $750,000 to do your first practice, your startup. So I think it's one of the bigger things, if not the biggest thing any and every doctor will ever do, is starting their own practice. And it is a big leap of faith. But, the banks know that you're going to do well. It's one of the lowest failed professions in America. So I think that's hugely helpful for the doctor to kind of realize that even though it is a big situation, there's a lot of unknown things that will happen throughout this process. But know that when you, again, have the right team in place, that will set you up for success without even knowing it, just because we run through this daily.
Definitely. So yeah, to your point, I think that, again, when we have these doctors that are working again as associates, and they are having to clinically operate under somebody else's philosophy, or they're coming into these practices and they're like a very high producing provider, there's really not a lot of mentorship happening, and they're growing their families, they're stressful, they can't really manage the staff because it's not their staff. It gets them in a place where the best decision that they can take once they've outgrown and they know that they have the clinical skills is to really add value to the community of their choosing under their terms, and be able to put a team together and be able to continue to evolve and develop their skills. Because to your point, speaking of financing and debt, they do go to dental school, they come in with a lot of debt, and now getting into another financial commitment. This is their biggest probably financial commitment other than the dental school debt. And so they are afraid of going out there and making the mistakes. And so it's important that they start planning financially to prepare themselves, that they know where they are, and they take, action steps to the minute you start planning. And I had a dentist that was a mutual client of ours, and she was an associate in a dental office. And she said, Maritza, I'm thinking about opening my practice, and when I do decide to open my practice, I'm going to be reaching out to you. You know who this is. And then,
Mhm.
2-3 years later, she's very successfully running her practice. But she did take a lot of the steps, to understand and prepare herself financially and mentally to be able to get in there. And to your point about leasing, most most commercial spaces, and especially after COVID, dentists are pretty much a very good tenant. So like
Absolutely.
every tenant in a building wants to have healthcare within their, as a tenant, because every landlord, simply because we have been proven to overcome every financial, crisis in the
Sure.
economy. And the banks make it also because they don't just hand out their money for free and take this liability just because they have faith in you. Like, the system is there, the, real estate market, or at least for leasing and or owning, depending on how you prepare yourself financially. But also the banks keep in mind that they already have done the statistics, and they know that you are most likely to make it work, right? and
Absolutely.
and and overcome every financial hardship. So that leads
That's
me
spot on.
to yeah, so to the next question, which is, now the dentist has gone through this, like roadblocks, and continues through this journey. And what is the next step? What is it that a dentist needs to do? Hey, I've already decided that I want to start practice ownership. I've already have, my financing in place. I
Mhm.
decided that I can only afford to lease, and or I can afford to do this. What do you say should be the next thing that they do?
So I would really, I think probably the next step would be to try to focus on sometimes more of a broader area of where you think you'd want to open your practice, because you have to think about your commute for the next 10 to 25 years potentially. So
So the long-term goals, right?
yeah, exactly. You got to see the forest through the trees, as they say. So yeah, I mean, I think that's important. I've worked with plenty of doctors that are open to multiple states, and they just kind of want to poke around and see, and that's great. I have some people that may have grown up in an area and they only want to be in that location, but really just depending on what you want to do. At that point, you want to start broader and just work your way in until you kind of figure out the formula and the solution based on your wants and your needs.
Perfect. So preparing, the practice vision, and understanding their long-term goals. And this could be both, where they want to be located, right? Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, absolutely. So our company runs these great demographic reports where everything's backed up by numbers and data, just to make sure that we're setting you up in the right location. I think one of my favorite things that I try to do is just be a good guidance in terms of the brokerage. I'll tell you if I don't think it's a great situation or solution, even if you love it. I'm not trying to burst the bubble, but I'll tell you why, and then the doctor will decide from there if they still want to try to move forward with it. But I think you just have to think a little bit further down the road, um, you know, rather than just focusing on day one when you open or the first year, just because you might plumb out, 5 to 8 operatories eventually, and then equip 3 or 4 to begin with. But in year 2 or 4 or 5, whenever it takes you to kind of get up and fully function and running, you have to think about that, because you can't just really up and move right down the street just because you outgrew the space. So it's
So you would
definitely
say
hard.
strategic planning. So thinking, reverse engineering from a long-term view, in terms of clinically their plans for expansion. Am I going to be a solo provider? Am I going
Mhm.
to have a multi-specialty? Um, is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, no, you said it better than me. Yeah, it again, as hard as it may seem, I think it's good to think the 2, 4, 10-year program, just to kind of see what you want to be doing. If you want to step back from the practice in year 6 and have 3 associates, you kind of have to plan ahead, where it might not be the right solution from day one, but in year 4, year 2, year 8, that's exactly what you want to be thinking about, is just further down the line.
Awesome.
And
I
again,
love
it's
that.
never easy, but you have to try to just make it work and figure it out and think it through.
Perfect. So yeah, I think that that's definitely a big, confusion for the doctors, because a lot of times we have doctors that have a long-term vision, and then, like you said earlier, they already have them so much debt, then they they need their long-term vision requires that they have a next, like a decent size space, and then that may be a situation where, when they're starting on by themselves, and they need to basically gradually bring in all of these associates, they have to have a really strong budgeting in place, a really strong,
Mhm.
strategic plan, for how they're going to equip and how they're going to bring in from patient zero. So
Mhm.
I work a lot with our doctors on doing feasibility assessments, and we work out of developing almost kind of like that long-term plan,
Mhm.
so that it fits that their vision, more or less. Which then brings me to the following question about what are some of the steps in terms of demographic analysis that need to be done, because I have had conversations with I'll give you one example. I had this one dentist from California reach out to me, and he was, he had been in his practice already for like 4 months into his office startup. And when he reached out to me, he was like, I worked with a consultant group and so on and so forth. And I started asking him these questions, like, how did you end up at this location? Because at the time where I spoke to the provider, he was answering the phones himself. He didn't have a team member in the office. And he
Mhm.
said, like, my parents are going to help me over the next 3 or 4 months, with covering my break even, or my operational expenses. But
Sure.
that's it. Like, I have 3 more months of cash flow because my parents are helping me. But I ended up opening a practice in this very saturated area, and I don't have a team. I don't have this. They recommended that I do this or I don't do that, and I'm stuck, and I'm about to just, go out of business before I even start my business, right? That was the
Sure.
whole problem. And so as I started asking him questions, it was all about not having that long-term vision,
Mhm.
opening in an area where there was no alignment between his business model or envisioned business model in the area
Sure.
where he selected his site, and then not having a strategic plan to make it work short term, so that to then be able to gradually get into, his long-term goals. And so tell me a little bit about demographics, and how that plays a role in the decision making and best practices for making that work.
Sure. Well, yeah. I mean, demographics is that's definitely the most important part, I think, through the process. I always tell my doctors my favorite thing, besides closing on a space for them, is looking through the demographics report, just because the numbers don't lie. Um, I think that's really the most important part. And then once you look through the demographics reports that we do for you, I think it's really important to think through what type of practice you want to do. If you want all Medicaid or no Medicaid, or um, fee for service, or a little combination of both. Um, that is going to really be the telling sign, is the demographics and the numbers. So you just really want to focus on a couple of different things that we'll provide. We give a lot of information to our doctors that we do to help them out, just to kind of map out the best areas to start looking for properties, again, based on the numbers and data. And I know a lot of my doctors, or not a lot, really every doctor, that's why they're in the positions they are. When they see a patient, they're not just pulling a tooth or filling a cavity or whatever the case may be. They ask the proper questions to try to figure out the situation and assess the problem that their patient has. And that's kind of what we do on a much lower level in through the real estate. Yeah, exactly.
There's one thing that always intrigued me, and I want you to share with our audience how you can decide who you want. Like, you can target your audience, right? And you can go through like the important aspects of the demographic. What are some of, in your experience, the most important parts of the demographic research to drive to like select the best possible location?
Sure. So through our demographics process, we analyze a large area, and then it's sort of a heat map to come up with a solution based on a few factors that we'll ask the doctors what they're trying to figure out. So somebody might come to me and say competition is my scariest problem. So we could find areas that are underserved based on specific ratios that I'd walk you through. Another one is median household income. I think a lot of people sort of think average household income is more important, but median really tells the whole story of that particular area.
Okay. So the median is more important than the average, in other words.
Yeah. So median really gives a picture of the entire area that you're looking for. Average might have some, a couple pockets of $10 million homes that will raise the average income just based on a couple of different neighborhoods, or the complete opposite, where there is some mobile homes, for example, where that would lower the income. So median just really gives a good snapshot. So I think on the demographics report, I would say competition. If you're a specialist, if you're a pediatric dentist, we'll focus on the children 18 and under and try to come up with a couple of areas that might have more children than the next, just being a couple miles away. And that's really what the demographics reports will do for our doctors.
How big of a deal is the expected growth of a specific area when selecting, a good site?
Sure. So I think it's important in some parts of the country, because I've opened a practice in about 7 or 8 different states now at this point. And I've learned a lot more even through when I first started working for my company, just kind of ramping up and learning the process of how my group practice real estate works. So I think it is important in some states, maybe Arizona or Texas or Florida, where certain parts of the country are just blowing up more so. But where we are in the Northeast, kind of New York, New Jersey area, the news makes it kind of seem that the states are emptying out, even though it might be a very little.
I don't went anywhere. Sorry.
Yeah, no, exactly. And they're always going to be around. So it just depends. Sometimes there's 500.
And there's an influx of people coming in. Like,
yeah, no, exactly. And it's like, I think it's important, but maybe not the most important factor, just because it's usually not going to be drastically high or drastically low.
Now, another thing that I really like about the demographic analysis that you do is that we have had, and again, this is a decision that it's so personal, and you have to do a lot of dirty work, if you will. So one of the things that intrigued me about you, that you mentioned, was you said, I had a particular doctor from a particular ethnic group, and he said, like, my people love bargains and love to ask me for discounts. So I'm trying to avoid having to specifically target, like, my like their target is like not their particular ethnic group. So tell me a little bit about if that's true, how ethical or unethical that is. But again, this is a very, very personal and long-term thing, and you really need to narrow down who your target audience is and define who it is not, to not end up in making a mistake on your first location.
Sure. No, I've definitely heard and seen a lot of things in my real estate days, so that's pretty true. It's through the demographics report, people can take what they will from it. If you really wanted to if you really wanted to focus on certain ethnicities, we can figure that out just based on what is provided to us. Of course, it doesn't matter to me or anyone really in my company. It's just a matter of what the doctor wants. Yeah, what he or she wants to see in terms of their patient base. We could figure that out for you. You can almost find out too much information on many different levels, but in the best way possible, just by having, proper demographics.
Perfect. So that's something we check off our, we give it we X the box off on that one. What is, as we're wrapping up and coming to because you've been very generous with your time, and I want to be able to respect that. What is?
If you need me to.
Say that again.
I'll stay on all day if you need me to.
Oh, thank you. So basically we've covered every milestone. Am I missing something? Let's now talk about misconceptions and mistakes that you've seen dentists make. Sure. that makes them go back and say, like, for instance, this one dentist that reached out to me from California, and how could he had avoided ending up in a location where he's treating the wrong audience, and he doesn't have a team, and he's miserable, and his parents are basically taking on helping him cover the expenses. How can we avoid having this type of situations?
Sure. Well, I mean, much like any real estate, it's location, location, location. So that's what the demographics process will do. I could find a bunch of pretty sites to send my doctors, but I don't just kind of cherry pick and go through and, short them of anything. I try to provide extra options just to kind of keep narrowing everything down until we find a couple of locations. And ideally, at the end of the day, you'll like a couple of locations, and then we can negotiate on a couple just to kind of sift through and see which one works best. So demographics and the location just really go hand in hand. Sometimes being 2.5 miles northwest of where you've always been set on opening a practice, where you grew up or have lived for the last 10 to 20 years, isn't always the best option. So I think it's just really backing everything up through the numbers and the data.
Beautiful. Now we have my last question, and then I'll let you just basically circle back on anything that I might have missed.
Sure.
What are some of the things that you feel would be things to consider when it comes to a lease negotiation?
Let the experts.
And that could be a whole separate conversation, but just an overview of 3 pointers or important parts as they're going, because we may have people thinking about starting their practice and early in the journey, but I get doctors that reach out to me and they're already in the process of doing a lease negotiation or something like that. Yeah. So what are like high level tips that you can give to someone in terms of what to be on the lookout for as they're negotiating a lease?
Sure. Well, so yeah, like you said, we could do another show just on the negotiation parts of it. But
I'll be happy
um,
to. Well, let's
yeah,
do it.
let's do it. Let's book it. So yeah, I mean, again, there's never really the same instance of a lease negotiation or like a letter of intent negotiation, just because you never really know who you're dealing with. At the end of the day, even if you work with the same, for myself, if I work with the same owner on a different location, it'll be different than the one 10 miles away that I had a lease signed for one of my doctors. So, I mean, you never really know what to expect throughout the process. There's always going to be surprises that kind of pop up and arise where, there's not one formula to kind of make it work. Sometimes you do have to get creative or reverse engineer back into it.
I see.
So, it's really just, again, leaning on your team that you work with. If you want to see a space, don't necessarily reach out to the broker directly. Have your buyer's rep or, your tenant rep kind of reach out for them, just because we'll put you in a better position than you would reaching out by yourself. And not to say that they can't do that. Of course, many doctors have made that work for themselves, I'm sure. But, it's just kind of helpful to know what to expect when you don't really know how it's going to work out. There's so many different things behind the scenes that are important for the doctor that they would never think about. And even though I had almost 10 years of residential experience, I have done a couple bodegas here and there, a couple restaurants in the city where the dental and medical side is, apples to giraffes, I like to say. It's not even
Got it.
There's just a lot of little nuances that you need to have set up in place before you move forward and essentially marry that owner for the next 10 to 20 years. So it's important to kind of.
So it's more like a dance rather than already like a set, like already a standard process or procedure.
Yeah, I mean, no two things will ever be the same. I talk with some doctors where I get some great questions. Again, they're smarter than me at the end of the day. That's why they're doctors and in their positions. But, sometimes they'll compare different situations just because their friend or their colleague did this or that when they did their practice. But unless it's in the same time, the same location, the same everything, size range, whatever it may be, you kind of have to compare everything to the situation at hand rather than thinking about, my friend bought this piece of real estate, how was she able to afford it? And I'll come to find out it's an hour and a half away in a different state. It's
the
not
same
the
that
same
happens
market.
with my business. And that brings me to all the noise out there and the place that we're in, where there's so many resources, but while you have all the resources, it becomes a lot more difficult for you to have confidence in your decisions, because the grass always seems to be greener on the other side. And then there is a lot of noise where they generalize things because they have a cookie cutter approach. And then they have one success story over here and they try to make that, the standard for the entire, general public, when it's a very, specific independent situation, to your point. So I get that. And I think that's great advice. Now, you had here, as part of the questions that I had, my instead of being at a question, because we worked on this before, was kind of like an advisory tip, and you spoke about open-mindedness and thoroughness. So tell me what your advice is for someone that is thinking about taking that leap of faith of starting on their own and wants to start considering a startup instead of going through the whole process of doing an acquisition. Sure. Given everything that we've shared here so far, that has been definitely really great. What is your last, piece of advice for any associate dentist out there that it's considering or leaning more towards startup versus acquiring an existing practice?
Sure. I mean, you just have to talk to people in the industry that deal with it on a daily basis. I think that's really the most important thing. Um, again, there's many right things that you could do. There's many wrong things that you could do, but it's good to kind of figure it out through our groups and through the people that live it. Essentially, I think that's really the most important thing. In terms of doing a startup, again, it might take a little longer to kind of ramp up, but it's not to say that you can't make it a hugely successful practice. And at the end of the day, you get to make it your own practice. So I think you just kind of have to sit back as a doctor and think, do I want to be my own boss? Am I prepared to just kind of work and do anything and everything to make this work? Or do I want to be an associate and do very well and, have set schedules of 3 or 4 days a week, whatever the doctor may work, of course. But, there's always going to be different challenges, but it really just, I think it needs to be a self-assessment to at least explore the option, just because a startup is a great option for a lot of doctors.
So I have here, based on our notes and our previous conversation, a comprehensive assessment and professional guidance. Those are your biggest, pieces of advice as far as when they make the decision to start their practice. And I think you've touched very well in every point here. And to your point, I think that as we wrap up, I'm a strong believer personally, from my personal experience and observation, is success is where planning and opportunity meet. And so in order for an opportunity to be there, you need to recognize it as such. And that requires a level of preparation and planning in order for you to even be aware that is an opportunity, right?
Yeah.
Because we may have opportunities come by us and we're just not ready. So like the teacher shows up when the student is ready, and Reed is here and I'm here, and there are many good resources out there, trustworthy resources that you can lean to be able to provide you with that guidance and to help equip you with the comprehensive assessment that is going to make this one shot that you're taking, this risk of business and practice ownership, the best shot it can be, right? And so I am so truly grateful for having you today. Tell us how people can find you, and if they want to connect with you. I know that I'm going to be asking my team, not myself, to enter your information on the link here after the meeting. And for anybody that has any questions, or if we didn't cover anything and you want to bring him back, I'm going to be on the ongoing basis. He's welcome to join us again. And so you can post it in the comments. Let us know how you found this episode, and your support is greatly appreciated. But yeah, tell us, Reed, how do we find you? How do we stay in touch with you?
Sure. No, absolutely. So my company name again is Practice Real Estate Group. We work nationally. We're not just limited to certain areas. I think we've probably opened a practice in, I want to say 37 to 40 practices collectively, throughout our company. We have a really good team and resources behind us, and we can help with every kind of specialty out there. So
perfect. So we'll leave your contact information on the description of the video. Thank you again for watching, for giving us your time and answering our questions. I look forward to doing another episode with you in the future. And for those of you watching, next week I'm going to bring on also, I have a great interview with someone from the financial wealth world, if you will. So I'm really excited about that. I will give the details on that in the next few days. Again, Reed, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. And I look forward to staying in touch with you and doing some more projects together.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Maritza. This was awesome. This was great. And we'll keep going, Thank you
All
again.
right. Sounds like a plan. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.